This is about the dark psychology of respect, specifically why fighting for it destroys it. Machiavelli understood something about respect that most people never learn. It's not earned through pleading. Picture a conference room where everybody is calm until you speak. Then someone tests you in front of witnesses. They talk over you. They smirk. They reframe your point like a joke. You hear a pen click from the far end of the table. Not nervous, not accidental, like a metronome. So you lean forward and you plead. Not loudly, polite. I'm not trying to be rude, but can we please just... And the room changes. There's a silence after the joke that doesn't feel neutral. It feels like your name just lost weight. Eyes drift away from you and toward the person who just made you petition. You can feel it. The respect didn't break. It evaporated. That's the status tax. You pay it the moment you fight for respect, because fighting is visible dependence. Here's the trap in one line. Every plea for respect creates status debt to the judge. Most people will tell you to stand up for yourself. They're giving you a map to a graveyard. You're about to see why your courage is actually a submission signal. When you feel disrespected, do you default to explanation or consequence? Stop treating it like a feeling. Treat it like mechanics. Most people treat respect like a reward for being good. That's why they plead for it. But respect is an inference. People guess your rank from what you do under pressure, what you tolerate, what you enforce, and how fast you start negotiating your own worth. And this is where people confuse two different outcomes. Prestige is voluntary deference, based on inferred competence. Dominance is coerced compliance, based on credible enforcement capacity. Fighting for respect usually produces neither. It signals you don't have enough prestige to be followed, and you don't have enough dominance to impose costs. The calculation is simple. If you had options, you wouldn't be bargaining for approval. If you had power, you wouldn't need to convince them to stop. This is status debt. Status debt is what happens when you petition. Petitioning frames the other person as the adjudicator. You become measurable. You become comparable. You become the applicant in their court. Now treat it like a crime scene, not how you felt. What happened? First, you accept their jurisdiction. The second you plead, you step onto their frame. Second, you hand them moral high ground for free. When you say, "I'm not trying to be rude," your brain thinks it's being polite, but neuroscience research on threat detection shows the amygdala registers a submission signal. You just announced, "I'm managing your comfort while I'm defending my position." Third, you leak your price. You show what you value: approval, harmony, being seen as reasonable. Now they know what to threaten next time. This is why status debt compounds. After you petition once, the next disrespect costs less for them. Because you taught the room you'll bargain for permission. The moment you clear the air is the moment you become measurable. Because clearing the air is usually code for, "Please confirm I'm still safe in the hierarchy." It's a hidden request for classification, and classification is where people get trapped. Now watch how this shows up everywhere, like the same virus in different bodies. Workplace. Someone talks over you in a meeting. You feel your authority leaking. So you over-justify and start defending your position like it's on trial. The room reads, applicant, family. A parent or sibling makes a disrespectful comment with that familiar tone, so you launch into the full history of how you've been treated. You think you're doing reputation maintenance through retaliation. The table reads, still auditioning. Relationships. Your partner crosses a line. You feel unseen, so you plead. Why can't you just respect me? And now the line isn't the line anymore. The line becomes your need. Different setting, same hierarchy math. Think about the last time you said, "I'm not trying to be rude," or "I just want to understand." Were you clarifying or were you applying for safety? And here's the part that makes the paradox feel cruel. Sometimes you win. They apologize, they soften, they say the right words, and then, the next day the energy changes. They test again, slightly. Not because they're evil, because your petition taught them the price. It taught them you'll trade sovereignty for reassurance. So if respect is inference, the real question becomes, What variable flips the entire interaction from applicant to reference point? It's not volume. It's not a better argument. It's not the perfect speech. It's dependence. And once you can see dependence, you can't unsee it, because it's the hidden currency running every respect negotiation. There's a cold rule in power dynamics that people hate because it doesn't care about your intentions. Power lives in the other person's dependence on you, not your desire for them. If your desired outcome is mediated by them, and you've few alternatives, they've leverage. This is the part most people never calculate. Dependence has two knobs: how much you value the outcome, and how many alternatives you've without them. When you fight for respect, you crank both knobs in public. You reveal that their validation matters to you, and you reveal you don't have enough alternatives to treat their validation as optional. Respect-seeking is a confession that the outcome is in the other person's hands. You literally announce, "You can grant or deny the thing I want." And the moment you make them the gatekeeper, you make yourself the applicant. This is why respect-seeking backfires, because it broadcasts scarcity of options and high valuation of approval. When you say, "I just want respect," what the other person hears is, "I need you to validate my position." Need is expensive. Need is legible. Need is the currency manipulators trade in. People feel the imbalance. They feel you leaning in. And the worst part is, you can broadcast need while being polite. You can sound calm and still sound low rank. Watch the language patterns that leak dependence, explanations that weren't requested, apologies that aren't paired with enforcement, over-justifying your boundaries, tag questions that ask permission for your own standards. Do you understand what I'm saying? Is that okay with you? I just feel like that's not communication. That's bargaining. There's research on this in the simplest possible form: powerless speech cues, hedges, disclaimers, formal deference markers, hesitations. These aren't moral flaws. They're status signals in contexts where the hierarchy is being negotiated. The politeness illusion is why low-cost compliance can still read as low rank, because low-cost compliance can be a mask for dependence. And people don't respond to the mask. They respond to the underlying trade. Here's what status bargaining looks like in real life. You write a paragraph where a sentence would have worked. You apologize for setting a boundary. You explain your reasons like you're submitting evidence to a jury. You over-clarify your tone. "I'm not trying to be rude, all of that's you paying status debt in installments. Think about the last time you sent a text and saw the typing bubbles appear, then disappear. Did you send a second message to clarify? If you did, you declared dependence. You told them your internal stability is mediated by their reply. Here's the cycle that destroys you if you don't catch it early. You feel disrespected. You respond softly, hoping they'll understand. Softness invites tests. Tests trigger more explaining. More explaining increases status debt. Debt compounds. That's how people train others to push them. They call it maturity, but maturity without enforcement is just vulnerability without protection. Here's the diagnostic. What you do when you're misunderstood reveals your position. If being misunderstood makes you chase clarity, over-explain, and plead for fairness, you're dependent. High-rank behavior isn't cold. It's non-urgent. It can tolerate being misread without collapsing. If you want your rank to rise, dependence has to fall. But dropping dependence is only half the battle. To truly own the room, you need the art of the fathomless lake, asymmetrical information sovereignty. That begins with Gracian. Gracian had a rule that sounds poetic until you realize it's a weapon. When you're fully understood, you're contained. People can't bargain with what they can't benchmark. They can't route around you if they can't map you. Measurability kills leverage. Gracian understood this like an assassin understands angles, not because he was violent, but because he lived in an environment where visibility was vulnerability. His book, The Art of Worldly Wisdom, isn't a self-help book. It's a survival manual for status ecosystems, where one wrong disclosure becomes a handle on your throat. His core principle is simple: never be fully seen. Good you are be. Because once people can see all the way through you, they don't respect you. They contain you. They reduce you. They summarize you into something manageable. Think of it like a fathomless lake. People respect the water more when they don't know how deep it goes. If you don't know the depth, you move carefully. That's how asymmetrical information sovereignty works. You control what's measurable and when. You don't publish your motives in real time. You don't narrate your limits as if the other person is entitled to your operating system. This isn't being mysterious for aesthetics. This is asymmetrical information control as deterrence. Robert Greene explored similar principles in The 48 Laws of Power, understanding that perceived depth creates natural reverence. Over-explanation collapses your leverage. It shrinks uncertainty, hands out comparison points, reveals triggers, and turns standards into negotiable arguments. Gracian's move is deliberate suspense. Give only what coordination requires, and refuse the extra disclosures that exist only to earn approval. When you feel tension, do you start narrating your intentions, or do you hold your position and let behavior speak? This is why do not explain overmuch isn't mysticism. It's valuation mechanics. The more you explain, the more you convert yourself into a comparable object. Now they can say, so that's your limit. Explanation becomes a blueprint for future disrespect. Controlled asymmetry preserves option value. If your limits and motives aren't fully measurable, people default to caution, and the burden of interpretation shifts onto them. Explicitness is containment. Once they can summarize you, they can manage you. Clarity can be a concession, and brevity can be a weapon. But here's the constraint that keeps this from becoming cosplay. Silence fails without competence or enforcement capacity. If you're incompetent, silence reads as confusion. If you're powerless, silence reads as submissiveness. If you're needy, silence reads as manipulation. So the move isn't be quiet. The move is be capable, then brief. And brief is controlled. How do you become opaque without being absent? You signal competence, but withhold motives. You show output, but you don't narrate your inner world. You set terms, but you don't litigate why the terms are fair. Example, instead of a monologue about your feelings and your history, use one boundary plus one consequence. Don't speak to me like that. If it happens again, I'm ending the conversation. Notice the common pattern. You're not asking for understanding. You're setting tempo and terms. Tempo control is a status signal. So install one rule. When provoked, pause 3 seconds before you speak. This is what people don't understand. Most respect negotiations aren't about the standard, they're about the frame. If you argue your standard, you accept their right to judge it. If you enforce your standard, you reveal sovereignty. Now let me prove the model with a leader who didn't debate. He acted, and one act replaced 1,000 explanations. But notice what just happened. Information control is private until someone turns it into a public spectacle that ends the argument forever. That spectacle is where Machiavelli becomes unavoidable. Machiavelli didn't treat respect like a warm feeling, he treated it like stability. If you're in charge, you don't need people to like you, you need them to anticipate predictable consequences. That's the core premise. Respect is an equilibrium, not a compliment, and the cleanest example is Cesare Borgia in Romagna. Romagna wasn't a philosophy seminar. It was a region with disorders, vendettas, and local power centers that had learned a simple habit: test authority until it bleeds. Borgia wants an enforced equilibrium, not a speech about order. Order. So he outsources harshness to a minister, Ramiro. Ramiro does what harsh enforcers do. He crushes disorder. Order returns. People comply. Now the problem. If Borgia keeps Ramiro, he becomes associated with the cruelty. If he argues, he looks defensive. If he pleads, he looks dependent. So he does something that modern people can't comprehend, because modern people think reputation is built with explanations. He executes Ramiro and displays him publicly. Machiavelli says the point was reputational detachment. Borgia wanted the regent to see the cruelty wasn't with him, but with the minister. So he didn't explain it, he showed it. Cesena. Morning. December 26, 1502. The piazza is waking up into winter air. Footsteps. Whispers. The early crowd assembling around a shape that doesn't belong. Then the visual resolves. Ramiro is there. Not alive. The body is cut in two. Next to it, a block of wood, and a bloody knife left like punctuation. The morning frost is still on the cobblestones. The blood isn't steaming anymore. It's dark and thick. People don't scream. They stand in a circle, paralyzed by the realization that the rules of the game just changed, without a single word being spoken. No proclamation. No justification. No argument for why this was necessary, just spectacle and silence. And the psychological effect is instant. The crowd doesn't need to be persuaded. They don't need to be convinced. They're amused and stupefied because Borgia just communicated three things without asking permission from language. 1. There's credible enforcement capacity here. This territory has a center of punishment. Disorder isn't free. 2. The center can also constrain its own violence. The enforcer is disposable. The sovereign isn't. So the hatred doesn't attach cleanly to the throne, but the fear still does. 3. Debate is over. Spectacle closes the door that arguments keep open. Words invite counterframes. A body in a square is a frame that eats the room. This is asymmetrical information control in its most brutal form. Borgia refuses to publish a motive. He refuses to negotiate a narrative. He forces the population to update their model through consequences. Silence plus spectacle equals sovereignty. The display turns rumor into certainty. One irreversible act replaces 1,000 explanations. Enforcement exists, and enforcement is constrained by the sovereign center. No speech is required. This is why public debate weakens you. Words invite counterframes. Actions close doors. Think about the last time you were disrespected in front of other people. Did you try to explain yourself into respect, or did you impose a consequence that ended the game? Debate creates a negotiation trap. The moment you argue, you create an opening. Maybe I can win this frame. You give them a stage. You let them save face by rejecting you publicly. Action changes payoffs. It doesn't require their agreement. This is why winning through argument is a beginner fantasy. Argument increases information without increasing leverage. Sometimes it's even interpreted as a status challenge. In steep hierarchies, the presumption to reason with the superior can be punished just to prevent precedent. Not because the superior is right, because the superior is enforcing rank. You've seen this in modern form. Correct a superior in public and you often get punished later, not for being wrong, but for challenging rank. And here's the darker lesson. Spectacle can create an enforced equilibrium, but mercy without deterrence leaks authority until the structure collapses. That leak has a name. Scipio. Machiavelli gives you a warning that's basically illegal to say in polite society. Kindness without deterrence is a suicide note. He points to Scipio Africanus as the contrast. Scipio is remembered as restrained, merciful, forbearing. And Scipio becomes a tragedy not because he was weak, but because he was moral inside a system that punishes morality without teeth. Scipio wanted to be loved by his men. Hannibal wanted to be a variable they couldn't ignore. In the end, Scipio's men mutinied because his kindness had removed the floor of their reality. They didn't hate him, they just didn't fear the cost of betraying him. That's what a deterrence leak looks like. Forbearance without credible enforcement capacity stops reading as virtue and starts reading as low-cost compliance from the center. If misconduct has no cost, misconduct becomes culture. Then discipline decays. And once discipline decays, mutiny isn't shocking. It's logical. Put that next to Hannibal. Hannibal is described as inhumanly cruel, not angry, not emotional. Cruel in the clinical sense, feared, disciplined, consistent. And his army stays loyal for a decade and a half in enemy territory. That doesn't make cruelty sacred. It makes deterrence non-negotiable. When you remove deterrence to protect your reputation as a good person, you don't become respected. You become safe to test. Where are you offering low-cost compliance to avoid conflict and calling it maturity? In what relationship did you try to be reasonable and train the other person to disrespect you? Now take the same contrast and pull it into modern psychology, because the lab has been measuring what Machiavelli described with blood and politics, and the results are uncomfortable on purpose. There are two stable routes to the top. Prestige. People follow you because you're useful. Dominance. People yield because you're dangerous. Both can produce influence, both can produce attention, and the difference matters. Prestige tends to pull people toward you voluntarily. Dominance pushes people away, while still extracting compliance. In group research, both routes predict influence, but they diverge on how you're evaluated. Prestige is often paired with being liked. Dominance is often paired with being feared and not being liked. But begging for respect matches neither route. It doesn't look like prestige because you're not letting competence do the talking. You're trying to talk your way into being believed. It doesn't look like dominance because you're not imposing costs. You're asking for mercy from the people testing you. So the audience reads a third posture: desperation. And desperation is a low-rank cue. That's not an insult, it's a signal. Emotion displays are part of the signal. Controlled anger can be read as high rank because it implies enforcement. Sadness and pleading can be read as low rank because it implies subjugation. This doesn't mean you should become angry. It means the room is reading cost signals. Anger, when controlled, often reads like, "There's a line here." Pleading reads like, "Please move the line for me." This is one of the few places where the lab and Machiavelli agree. In Titan's 2001 Stanford research on status conferral, observers consistently assign higher status to targets who display anger than to targets who display sadness. Not because anger is morally superior, but because anger is processed as a boundary signal, and the key word is controlled. The studies aren't rewarding tantrums, they're capturing a perception rule. Anger implies you'll impose a cost. Sadness implies you'll absorb the cost. Anger also increases perceived competence, which then becomes the bridge to higher status. Observers don't just like the angry target more, they treat the angry target as higher rank, more leadership potential, more autonomy, more authority. Why? Because the brain is wired to mistake boundaries for competence. If you signal a line and the line holds, the nervous system updates, this person governs outcomes. So when you plead you aren't being authentic, you're publishing a low-rank emotion signature in a hierarchy negotiation. When you're disrespected, do you look wounded or do you look governed? Do you leak sadness and explanation, or do you signal a standard and a consequence? Your humility might be read as permission to ignore you. That's why I'm just trying to be humble fails when you're unproven. High competence can spend imperfection. Average competence can't. The same softness becomes diagnostic. And in some ecologies, doing nothing isn't peace, it's reclassification. The fix still isn't fighting. It's consequence. Make disrespect expensive. So here's the distinction you must learn, or you'll keep making the same mistake with different words. Controlled boundary, calm tone, clear standard, real consequence. Emotional explosion, heat, noise, discharge, then regret. Pleading explanations, petitions, long speeches, requests for validation. Only one of those consistently raises perceived rank, and it's not the one that feels socially safe. People keep thinking respect is about being liked. It's about what you can be safely done to. This follows social exchange theory, the implicit cost-benefit calculations people make when deciding whether to test your boundaries or comply with your standards. Language is part of the ranking system. If you constantly hedge and soften, you tell the room you don't expect to be taken seriously. Don't confuse politeness with submission. Submission is dependence. Right isn't the only currency. Presence, tempo, and enforcement are currency. So the question becomes, how do you exit status debt without becoming a tyrant? How do you stop begging without turning into a cartoon villain? You use a protocol. And if you try to improvise this under pressure, you'll default to pleading. So I'm not giving you inspiration. I'm giving you drills. This isn't be mean. This isn't be cold. This isn't an alpha roleplay. This is governance. Stop litigating your worth. Replace arguments with standards and consequences. If you argue your worth, you accept their court. If you set a standard, you set reality. Strategic civility. Calm tone, hard edge. No over-explaining, no emotional petitions. You can be polite while refusing to negotiate. Politeness is style. Sovereignty is substance. Build enforcement capacity, legal leverage, economic leverage, reputational leverage, relational leverage. Most people try to win respect with words because they lack credible enforcement capacity. Build leverage quietly, documentation, options, and the ability to remove access. Create options. Alternatives reduce dependence. Dependence reduction increases rank. The one-sentence boundary that ends most respect negotiations is this: if you continue, I'll leave. Not screamed, not begged, stated, then executed if needed. Memorize these. Don't add I think or maybe. Use them like surgical strikes. First, the boundary. Don't speak to me like that. Second, the consequence. If it happens again, this conversation is over. Finally, the exit. Stop talking. Change behavior. Leave. End the call. Close the laptop. Withdraw access. No courtroom speech. No childhood history. No you made me feel. No begging for them to understand. Understanding is optional. Compliance isn't. Where are you still trying to purchase respect with explanations? Pick one place this week and replace the speech with a standard and a consequence. In the workplace, move it to writing. In family systems, leave on tone. In relationships, pause and change access if it repeats. Silent but needy, opaque but incompetent, harsh without control, tantrums disguised as dominance, and the quiet killer. Setting a boundary, then negotiating it until it becomes a request. This protocol exits status debt because it changes the frame. You stop asking for respect. You stop auditioning for classification. You stop making the other person the judge. You act like the standard is already real, because it's. When you enforce it, now compress it into one directive you can remember under pressure, because if you remember only one line, you won't relapse into petitioning the next time the room turns cold. Here's your new rule. Respect follows sovereignty, and sovereignty collapses the moment you petition. If you keep fighting for respect, you'll keep paying the status tax. Not because you're wrong, because the fight itself is a dependence signal. Identify one place you over-explain or seek validation, and remove it for 7 days. Replace it with one action, a brief boundary plus consequence, or a brief demonstration of competence that makes your value undeniable. And when your nervous system screams for you to explain, treat that scream like a lie. It's not integrity, it's dependence asking for a quick hit. If you've the stomach for the truth, subscribe, then report back in comments. And after you test this, comment, status debt.